Let us turn in our Bibles once again to the book of Psalms and Psalm 46. The current pandemic has not only forced us to adapt to a new lifestyle, it has also forced us to learn a new vocabulary. Words and phrases which we never heard and never used before are now part of our everyday speech. And one of those is the phrase, unprecedented times. How many times during the past couple of weeks have you heard someone say that we are living in unprecedented times? Now, if you haven't quite got round to looking up a dictionary yet, as I had to do the other day, then what it simply means is that we are in a situation for which there is no precedent. A situation for which there are no previous instances or examples. And for most of us, if not all of us this morning, then that is certainly true in the sense that we have never been here before. We've never been through anything like this before. Never before have we been locked up in our homes all day, every day. And consequently, the question you may be asking this morning is, what can we do in these unprecedented times? What can we possibly do as a church during these unprecedented times? Well, one of the things that we can do is that we can look back over our history and see what previous generations of God's people have done as they passed through unprecedented times. What lessons did they learn? What conclusions did they come to? Which brings us to Psalm 46. And the first thing we have in this psalm is in verses 1 to 3. And there we are given a comforting certainty in unprecedented times. A comforting certainty in unprecedented times. Now, although we are not told much about the background to this psalm, the one thing that we do know is that it is a corporate psalm. Did you notice that? For example, the people of God, they're speaking together throughout the psalm. Verse 1, God is our refuge. Verse 2, we will not fear. Verse 4 refers to the city of God. Verse 7, the Lord Almighty is with us. This is not a psalm that describes the experience of a believing individual. There are plenty of other psalms that do that. But this one is one that describes the experience of a believing community. And as this believing community of God's people express their faith, they certainly allow for the possibility of passing through unprecedented times. So, for example, in verse 2, they speak about the possibility of the earth giving way and of the mountains falling into the heart of the sea. In verse 3, they refer to the possibility of the sea roaring and foaming and the mountains quaking with their surging. What we have in verses 2 and 3 is a description of catastrophic and cataclysmic events. It's a description of extreme scenarios, the worst scenarios that you could possibly imagine, scenarios of an earth-moving, sea-urging, mountain-crumbling proportion. And what they are saying in these opening 3 verses is that even if such unprecedented events were to occur, we, as the believing people of God, do not need to fear. And why not? What is it that gives these people such comfort and such confidence, even in the face of such devastating and disastrous possibilities? Is it downright naivety on their part? No, it's not. So what is it then? Well, it's interesting to notice that verse 2 begins with the word therefore. And that means that if you want to know the reasoning, the logic behind verses 2 and 3, then you go back to verse 1. And here is what it says. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Although we are not explicitly told a historical background to this psalm, the language suggests that there was one, and it may well have been the one described in the book of Isaiah, chapters 36 and 37. During King Hezekiah's reign, King Sennacherib, king of Assyria, which was the great superpower on the world stage at that time, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, he attacked the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. But when he came to Jerusalem, the capital, he sent a messenger to Hezekiah saying, "On what are you basing this confidence of yours? On whom are you depending that you rebel against me?" He later sent another messenger who shouted to the people of Jerusalem, and here is what he said: "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. He cannot deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah persuade you to trust in the Lord when he says, 'The Lord will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria.' Has the God of any nation ever delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad and so on? Who of all the gods of these countries has been able to save his land from me? How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand?" What Sennacherib didn't realize was that the God of Hezekiah, the God of Judah, was very different from the so-called gods of the surrounding nations. For one thing, Judah's God was a real God. Judah's God was the true and living and eternal God. Judah's God was a powerful God. Judah's God was a God who could provide safety and security for his people in the face of the most frightening situations, even Sennacherib. And he did so on that occasion by sending the angel of the Lord into the Assyrian camp during the night and killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. And when Sennacherib woke up the next morning and saw what had happened, he took to his heels. And it's in the light of that experience that these people sang, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, no matter what happens." You see, their recent history enabled them to know the certainty of God's help and strength and refuge, even in unprecedented times. And what we must never forget is that their history as the people of God back then is our history as the people of God this morning. They are our forefathers in the faith. And their experience back then and throughout subsequent generations and centuries allows us to say this morning, as we look back over the history of the people of God, it allows us to say this morning as the people of God, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, even if the earth should give way. Well, please note, that is not to say that we will be exempt from the trials and troubles of life in this world. Christians throughout the world today are being affected by the coronavirus pandemic as much as everyone else is. This psalm is not guaranteeing an exemption from the trials and troubles of life in this world. If our history as a people teaches us anything, it teaches us that living for God in this world brings across our path trials and troubles of various kinds. And so this psalm is not guaranteeing a trouble-free existence for the people of God. But what this psalm is guaranteeing is a God in whom we can find refuge and strength and help, even in the most difficult and troubling of circumstances. It is probably true to say that our world is faced with more uncertainty today than it has been for a very long time. Some of us have known that at a very personal level. For example, holiday plans have had to be shelved for the foreseeable future, and their weddings have had to be postponed. Non-urgent medical procedures are cancelled until further notice. Church life has become virtual for the time being. And the question everyone desperately wants an answer to is this: when is life going to return to normal? I'm sure you've thought about that question during the course of this past week. When is life going to return to normal? And the simple and straightforward answer is, we just do not know. Never before have we known such uncertainty in life. And yet, in spite of the enormous and numerous uncertainties which we are faced with at present, we do have some certainties as believing Christian people, and one of those certainties is that we have a God in whom we can find refuge and strength and help, regardless of what happens. And for that reason, we do not need to fear. That is a certainty, a comforting certainty, even in these unprecedented times. Moving on, secondly, we see in verses 4 to 7 a divine distinction in unprecedented times, a divine distinction in unprecedented times. Now, it's probably true to say that most of the great cities of our world have grown up around great rivers. For example, flowing through the centre of London, you have the River Thames. Flowing through the centre of Paris, you have the Seine. Flowing through Budapest, we have the Danube. And flowing through Glasgow, you have the River Clyde. As those great cities were being established, those rivers provided security and commerce and a plentiful supply of drinking water, although you probably wouldn't want to drink too much from them today. But the interesting thing is that Jerusalem didn't have a river of any significance flowing through it. And that could be particularly difficult and dangerous in ancient times, as an attacking army could surround the city, they could besiege it, and they could cut off any supplies of food and water, and so they could prevent any fresh water from entering it. And it was for that reason that King Hezekiah constructed a channel to transport water from a spring outside the city. We read about it in 2 Chronicles chapter 32. He constructed a channel so that he could transport water from a spring outside the city and bring his fresh water right into the city. And consequently, the psalmist can say in verse 4, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. And that river no doubt proved to be critical during the Assyrian siege that we read about in Isaiah 36. But although that river was strategic, the real reason the city was preserved during the Assyrian siege was not primarily due to the city's river that we read about in the first half of verse 4. Instead, it was due to the city's resident that we read about in the second half of verse 4. You see, residing within the walls of Old Testament Jerusalem was not merely the king of Judah, but the king of all the earth. The reason it was called the city of God in Old Testament times was because it was the holy place where the Most High dwelt. It was Jerusalem that God had chosen for the building of the temple, and it was within that temple that God had chosen to presence himself in a very special way. That's what made Jerusalem unique back then. As verse 5 says, God is within her. And that is the reason why she did not fall to Sennacherib in 701 BC. Being within her, the eternal God came to her rescue at break of day, verse 5, as that was the time when Sennacherib discovered his 185,000 dead soldiers and quickly retreated. Can you picture it? The superpower of that day goes to bed one night assuming that victory is imminent. He goes to bed one night assuming that victory is guaranteed in the morning, only to wake up the next morning and discover that his army has been thoroughly decimated. It's a brilliant example of what we are told in verse 6. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. Now, back in verses 2 and 3, we had a description of big cataclysmic events within the natural world. And now in verse 6, we have a description of big cataclysmic events within the political world. And you know as well as I do that the fall of Sennacherib was not the last of those to occur. Throughout history, we have continued to see big kingdoms. We've continued to see great big empires. We've continued to see big businesses, powerful people, and big, powerful institutions, and we've seen them rise to great power and influence, only to then watch them fall to utter insignificance. Look back over the history of the world, and that is a recurring pattern. And the question this morning is, how do you know that won't happen to the Church of Jesus Christ in these unprecedented times? We live at a time when there is a serious doubt about the future of some of our country's biggest companies and some of our world's most prominent institutions. And so at a time like this, which is unpredictable and unprecedented to say the least, the question you may be asking yourself is there anything about the Christian church that guarantees her survival and guarantees her future through these unprecedented times? Yes, there is. And it is the presence of God. As you read through the New Testament, and particularly passages such as Ephesians 2 and 1 Corinthians 3, you discover that the Old Testament temple finds its fulfillment today in the Church of Jesus Christ. For example, speaking about the church, Paul says in the closing verses of Ephesians chapter 2, he says that in him, i.e. in Christ, the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. The author of Hebrews says in chapter 12 of his book, that as believers in Jesus Christ, we have come to Mount Zion, to the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God. We have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. The Jerusalem of Old Testament times and the Old Testament and the temple of Old Testament Jerusalem was merely a shadow pointing forward, not to another building or another city of bricks and mortar, but pointing forward to a far greater reality, a spiritual reality, an eternal reality. It was pointing forward to a people whom God would dwell amongst by his Spirit in this present era, and it was ultimately pointing forward to a new Jerusalem where God would dwell with his people for all eternity. And so just as it was the presence of God within her that made Old Testament Jerusalem distinct in Old Testament times, So it is the presence of God within his people and amongst his people that makes the church of Jesus Christ unique today. To use the language of Psalm 46, verse 5, God is within her. To use the language of verse 4, the church is the holy place where the Most High now dwells in a unique way. And so, contrary to what our world thinks, we are not just another group or society this morning. There is something different, and there is something distinct about the church of Jesus Christ. Dwelling within her by his Spirit is the living and the eternal God. And it is that divine distinction that guarantees her preservation and ensures her permanence throughout the history of this world, regardless of how turbulent and unpredictable that history may be. As the psalmist says in verse 5, God is within her. She will not fall. His presence amongst us distinguishes the church, makes the church unique, and provides her with all the security that she needs, even in these unprecedented times. Thirdly and finally, we read in verses 8 to 11 about a powerful peace in unprecedented times. A powerful peace in unprecedented times. Now, the final section of the psalm begins with an invitation. Come and see the works of the Lord. But be warned, if you accept the invitation and come and have a look at what the Lord has done, you might on this occasion get a bit of a surprise. It might not be what you were expecting. Come and see the works of the Lord, the desolations he has brought on the earth. And if the miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem from the Assyrian siege is the background to this psalm, then you can imagine what this invitation meant for the inhabitants of Jerusalem on that occasion. Come and see the works of the Lord. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers lying dead in their camp. It would be a similar sight to that which a previous generation of Israelites had witnessed as they stood on the shores of the Red Sea, described for us in that Song of Moses that we read from in Exodus 15 at the start of the service. Oh yes, there have been numerous occasions throughout history when our God has brought about a scene of desolation on the earth. But please note, it hasn't been desolation for desolation's sake. Instead, it has been desolation in order to secure peace for his people. That is why Psalm 46 immediately goes on to say, verse 9, he makes war cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shield with fire. The desolation of verse 8 has led to the tremendous peace of verse 9, and it has done so on numerous occasions throughout history. For example, just to go back to the book of Exodus, the reason God brought about a scene of desolation at the Red Sea was in order to secure the safe deliverance of his people from an Egyptian Pharaoh. The reason God brought about a scene of desolation outside Jerusalem that night in 701 BC was in order to deliver his people from Sennacherib and secure their safety and security within the walls of Jerusalem. And most importantly of all, the reason God brought about a scene of desolation on Mount Calvary many years later was so that he might rescue his people from the tyranny and consequences of sin and bring them into a state of peace with himself. Oh yes, the death of Jesus Christ upon the cross was also a scene of desolation. We have heard during this past week about people who need to be socially isolated. But do you realize that at the cross, we see someone experiencing an isolation of a completely different order altogether? As God the Father punished his Son for the sins of his people, the Son experienced an isolation and a desolation and a God-forsakenness that this world had never seen before. That is why it was shrouded in darkness. It was, as far as Jesus was concerned, it was so bad that he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But as on those previous occasions we've looked at this morning, the desolation at the cross had a purpose to it. God the Father brought it about. It didn't happen by accident. God the Father brought it about, and the Son endured it so that sinful, hell-deserving people like you and me might never experience it. It happened so that through trusting in the Jesus who suffered that desolation, sinners like you and me might know peace with God in the present and be able to look forward to a new creation in which there will be true and lasting peace forever. You see, what our world leaders cannot achieve this morning, and that's not a criticism, that is simply how it is. What our world leaders cannot achieve this morning, a returning, conquering Jesus is going to achieve one day. It is then that there will be a new heaven and a new earth which is completely free of disease and death. Does that not sound attractive to you this morning? I'm sure it does. It is then that wars will cease to the ends of the earth, verse 9. It is then that God will be fully and finally exalted among the nations, verse 10. It is a returning victorious Jesus who will accomplish those things on a future day. But through trusting in this Jesus now, you and I can, in the meantime, be still, verse 10. And know that he is God. In a world that is currently spinning, to use one political commentator's words, in a world that is currently spinning and reeling due to fear and uncertainty and a tremendous sense of helplessness, we as the people of God can have the calm confidence that our God is in control. In the midst of all the upheaval and desperation, even in unprecedented times, we can, says the psalmist, we can be still and know that he is God. Through faith in Jesus Christ, we can say with the people of God throughout history, verse 11, the Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Don't you long for such peace and such assurance at such a time as this? Well, through trusting in Jesus Christ, that is the powerful peace that we can enjoy. The peace and the confidence and the assurance of knowing that God is God and that he is in control. The peace and the confidence and the assurance that comes from knowing that this great and almighty and all-powerful God is with us and that he is our fortress. He is our source of safety and security this morning. That is the powerful peace that through faith in Jesus Christ we can enjoy today, even in these unprecedented times. 3 important things to remember from Psalm 46 as we pass through these unprecedented times. Firstly, verses 1 to 3, we have the comfort and certainty as the people of God that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble, and therefore we do not need to fear. Secondly, verses 4 to 7, we have that divine distinction that characterizes the Church of Jesus Christ throughout the world today, that God is within her by his Spirit, and therefore we can have the assurance that she will not fall, not even in these unprecedented times. And thirdly, there is that powerful peace that comes from knowing that the Lord Almighty is with us, which enables us, even in such difficult times as this, to be still and to know that he is God.